because you're here.
Strangers Chapter 1 is the third film in the Strangers franchise, and it's the beginning of a brand new trilogy of Strangers movies. I love the first Strangers movie. I think that film is super underrated, and I think it was far ahead of its time when it came out. And Strangers Prey at Night, even though it's not nearly as good as the first one in pretty much any way, I think that film has some redeeming qualities about it, and I think that film in its own right is also a wee bit underrated. So the idea of a new epic trilogy of Strangers movies pumped my veins full of excitement, but I did go into this movie with lower expectations as like a safety net for myself, so I wouldn't be too disappointed. But anyway, Strangers Chapter 1 comes out today worldwide, but the preview screenings were last night, and I saw the earliest possible showing that I could in my state, and I have a lot of thoughts that I want to share with you guys. This is going to be a spoiler-free review, but I will talk about spoilers at the very end, but I'll warn you before I do that. But before we jump into the review, hit that subscribe button. I talk about movies all the time on this page. I love horror movies, and I'd love to talk about horror movies even more going forward. In fact, I'm debating if I should make a video talking about the first two Strangers movies. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But I also talk about TV shows and I talk about video games. I talk about video games a lot. But anyway, what is Strangers Chapter 1? Because there's honestly been a lot of confusion in the marketing for this movie. I've seen a lot of comments online of people not really knowing what this movie is. Some of the marketing describes it as a prequel to the first two movies, and other marketing describes it as a continuation of the first two movies, but most of the marketing is in agreement that this movie takes place in the same continuity. And after seeing the movie, I feel like I can tell you with 100% certainty that neither of those things are true. This movie is definitely not a prequel. The first movie was very much a product of its time, and it takes place around the time the movie came out. The characters have flip phones and they drive a late 90s Volvo. But in this movie, it's very, very modern. They have smartphones, they have the Airbnb app, they have the Alley app. There's no way in hell this movie is a prequel, and anyone that says otherwise is wrong, even if it's the filmmakers themselves. But at the same time, I genuinely don't think that this movie is a sequel to those first two movies either. I'm not going to spoil Strangers Prey at Night for you if you haven't seen it already, but if you've seen the ending of that movie, it wouldn't really make sense that this is a sequel. But the main reason I don't think that this is a sequel either is because the killers act pretty much entirely different from the killers in the first movie and the killers in the second movie, even though those are supposed to be the same killers. So what I think that this movie is, after seeing it, is this is pretty much a remake of the first movie. This is a new beginning in a new timeline of Strangers movies. And again, this movie acts pretty much exactly like a remake. The only thing that's different from the 2008 movie is that it's set in present day and it takes place in an Airbnb in Oregon instead of a vacation home in the Carolinas. Again, I'm not going to spoil it here, but so much of this movie, from the plot points to the character beats to even just the smaller tense moments, is pretty much exactly what happens in the 2008 movie. This movie is a remake. And when this movie started, the first 20-30 minutes of this movie, when I was expecting it to be in some way a continuation of the first two movies, whether that be a prequel or a sequel, I was disappointed because the direction style was different. It wasn't as slow. It wasn't as methodical. The killers were acting pretty much entirely different, like I said before. But once I started to realize that this isn't a continuation, even if they say it is, it's not. Once I started to accept this movie as a new beginning in a new timeline, when I started to think of this movie as its own thing, is when I really started to realize that I liked this movie. And I did. I think Strangers Chapter 1 is a pretty solid home invasion thriller with some slasher elements to it in its own right. I actually liked the two main characters, the couple that you follow throughout this movie's plot. I found them likable and I was actually rooting for them, which is probably the first time that's happened in a Strangers movie. I rewatched the first two leading up into this, and I liked the characters in the first movie, but I wouldn't say they were likable. And then the characters in the second movie were pretty horrendous, except for the brother. In this movie, I actually liked the characters again, and I was rooting for them. I was hoping that they would outsmart the killers. Every time they did something smart, I was like, yes. Every time that they were in peril, I was worried for them. And that's paired perfectly with how likable I found the killers in this movie. Are they as good as the killers in the original movie? No. Is their body language as good as the killers in the original movie? No. But again, when you think of them as their own unique killers, I thought they were creepy. I thought that they were dominant. They dominated the environment. They dominated the screen. They were horrifying. They were creepy. But at the same time, as it should be, they felt very human at times. There were moments where the camera lingered on them, and you realize that these are human beings under the mask. They're not boogeymen. And now when it comes to the direction of The Strangers Chapter 1, I actually liked the direction in this movie a lot. It's not directed like the first movie, so don't expect it again to be slow and methodical and to have some smart scares in it and some smart camera work. This movie isn't directed like that. But it does have moments that linger, that build tension, and then it has moments that are quick and fast, and it really gets your adrenaline pumping. This movie does a really good job of making us, the viewer, feel like we're feeling what the characters are feeling, what the survivors are feeling. And that is a great feat for a horror film. There were a handful of moments in that movie where the scares got me, and I remember thinking that got me. There were a couple moments where I jumped back in my seat a little bit. Jump scares that were actually effective, that weren't fake out jump scares. And then there were other moments where I thought, oh wow, I bet I'll remember this scene in a year from now, which I wasn't expecting going into the movie. But again, it's not the sort of direction style I initially wanted for a Strangers movie. And again, if you go into this movie expecting it to feel tonally like that original Strangers movie, you're gonna be very, very disappointed with it. But again, when I opened my mind, when I thought of this as its own movie set in its own universe, I really, really enjoyed it. Not just with the narrative, but with the direction as well. In fact, I'd love to see this director do more slasher films and horror films in general. If you gave him a different horror IP that was more directly suited for his direction style, I bet he would kill it. And now I'm going to talk about some of the cons that I had with Strangers Chapter 1. It does have a lot of negative trappings that come with very generic, cliche horror movies, or more specifically slasher movies. It has a lot of creepy small town with creepy small town resident scenes to it, which I didn't like. Those are overdone and overplayed. And one of the main characters, I won't tell you which because I don't want to spoil anything, but one of the main characters in particular makes so many bad decisions in the beginning of this movie to the point where I was just rolling my eyes. It did kind of break the immersion a little bit. And I know making bad decisions is a trope in horror movies and slasher movies, but it was extra noticeable in this. But luckily that character did start to become smarter as the film progressed. And like I said earlier, some of the horror in this film was very effective and it was directed very well. But in the earlier parts of this movie, there's a lot of cheap horror scenes. Like there's a scene where like a character is standing there and then just a figure walks in front of the camera, and it's like, who thought that that was clever? Who thought that would be scary? Who wants to see that for the 100 millionth time? And then when the movie ended, in hindsight, and I saw how good the thrilling aspects in this movie could be, it makes me relook at those earlier moments in the film and think, you were smarter than that. Why did you do that? Is Strangers Chapter 1 as good or better than the original? No, not even close. But I do think that Strangers Chapter 1 is significantly better than Strangers Prey at Night. And in a time where we're getting a decent amount of good quality slasher movies, like the new Scream movies, Thanksgiving, X, stuff like that, I genuinely think The Strangers Chapter 1 fits right alongside those. It manages to hold its own and to be part of the same conversation as those movies. But with that being said, I don't like being a pessimist. I'm a very optimistic person, but based on how this movie ended, I don't think I'm going to like Strangers Chapter 2 at all. It's just, I have a feeling the narrative that they're setting up isn't going to interest me, but I'd love to be proven wrong. But anyway, that's my spoiler-free thoughts. Now I'm gonna get into some brief spoilers. Fair warning here. But like I said, this movie, whether or not the filmmakers and the producers want to acknowledge it, this is pretty much a remake of the first movie. Like I said, so many moments follow the exact structure of the first movie. The couple shows up in the house, the boyfriend leaves, the girl is left alone, and then when she's left alone is when she starts to get terrified for the first time, knocking at the door, people breaking into the house, looking at her. Follows the same structure. Then he comes back, he doesn't believe her at first, and then he starts to believe her, just like the original movie. For the love of God, there's even a scene where the male main character accidentally shoots a character in the head with a shotgun that he didn't mean to shoot, just like the first movie. Except for in the first movie, it was super well done and super atmospheric and super tense and super memorable. This movie, that scene just felt like a cheap knockoff of it that wasn't nearly as effective or as important to the narrative. There's even a moment where they go to escape in a car and then the truck pins them in, just like in the original. And then it ends pretty much the exact same way as how the first movie ends. This is a remake, just again, a modern remake set in a different state. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Strangers Chapter 1. Have you seen it? If you have, let me know what you've thought about it in the comments. If you haven't seen it yet, thanks for watching this far, and let me know, are you going to watch it or are you going to skip it completely? Once again, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.